Hi and welcome back to the channel. This time around I am doing one of the Earth science fiction movies, 1927's Metropolis, directed by Fritz Lang from a script by Theo von Harbu. Not the Metropolis that the Joker nuked in Injustice, the original one that inspired Siegel and Schuster to give Superman City a name. And the version that I've got, which I love because it's as complete as we're probably going to get, is the Kino Lorber edition, which has extra footage in it. The story of reconstructing this movie is a bloody saga. There was an American version which had lots of bits cut out of it, and the guy who edited it together for the American studios put in fade outs and fade ins because he liked fade outs and fade ins in between scenes. And that became the kind of definitive version for about 60 years or so. Then some more footage was found of longer versions. They found it all across the world. There was some in Czechoslovakia, there was some in Russia. There was even some here in Melbourne, Australia. And then in Buenos Aires, somebody found a 16mm print which had been scored from the original nitrate in the 1970s. It was pretty scarred up and manky looking. But they incorporated it into the Kino Lorber edition to give us as full a version of Metropolis as we're ever going to get. And I'm here to talk about it and tell you why I think that this belongs in your collection. By the way, I'll get this out of the way too. I also have the English adaptation of the novel by Theo von Harbu, which is kind of cool. Not many of these ones are around at the moment. But I like having a copy of it. I haven't read it yet. But there it is. The cover's very, very kind of 1960s art. I think it's a Jack Gauguin artwork. But really cool to have that Ace edition. Scrounging around in second-hand bookshops is often good value for movie buffs. So in 1927, UFA made Metropolis with Fritz Lang, who had been on a run of really successful films. Of course, he did Dr. Mabuse the Gambler. He did Spione, which is fantastic. He also did a version of Die Nibelung, which was crazy popular across the world. So UFA gave him 5 million marks to make this film. Now, we've got to put this into a kind of social context for 1927 Germany. Between 1921 and 1923, the Weimar Republic in Germany had hyperinflation. Inflation went crazy and people starved. People went into the sex industry in enormous numbers. At one stage in Berlin, a quarter of the people were involved in some way in the sex trade. Sex tourism into Germany was enormous in the 1920s. And that decadence and that devil may care attitude and that desperation infects and kind of permeates many scenes in Metropolis, because it was only a few years before that all of this stuff happened. In 1923, the Allies realised that getting Germany to pay reparations was enormously damaging to Germany and millions of people, so they kind of stopped that. And the weird thing is that the inflation rate got so high in Germany that they knocked 12 zeros off all the prices for everything in the country. 12 zeros. That's how high the inflation rate went. It was crazy. And Germany was still suffering from the aftermath of this when Metropolis was made. When you see the scenes of all the children that Maria rescues, and I'm getting a little ahead here, but bear with me. When you see all of the film of all the kids that Maria rescues, and you've got all those scrawny looking kids, those extras were scrawny looking kids because people were still in a bad way in Germany at the time. We've got this enormous city of Metropolis, which is enormous skyscrapers and elevated roadways and aeroplanes flying between these enormous canyons of buildings, which was very much inspired by a 1924 trip to New York City that Fritz Lang made, and he was incredibly impressed with the skyscrapers in New York, and that stayed with him. At the start of the movie, we see the workers trudging in and out of their 10-hour-a-day work shifts. And the workers look almost robotic as they trudge in lockstep in and out of And we see a whole bunch of the people, and they're all men, getting into an elevator and going downwards, and we think, okay, well, they're going to go to work and travel downwards to go to work. But no, their part of Metropolis is deep, deep underground, and those weary workers are going home. And that kind of tilts the narrative wonderfully. We think that we've got a tendency, because of coal mines and things like that, to think that people who are descending in elevators in a work environment are going down to a mine. But no, they're actually going home. All of the machinery that keeps the city running is higher than when the workers actually live. And that's an interesting twist on the expectations that we have of that particular part of the film. And before I go any further, I've got to give a shout out to the fact that they re-recorded the original music score for Metropolis for this 2010 edition that Kino Lorber released. Gottfried Huppert's music is perfect for this film. It hits all of the beats, and in a silent film, when you need something to make a big impact, you've got a big clash of cymbals and things like that. The music is great. Now, of course, we remember in the 1980s when Giorgio Moroder butchered Metropolis and put in a whole bunch of pop songs and a lot of coloured filters and gave us a kind of popped up version of the American edition of the movie. I didn't like that version even when I saw it in the 1980s. The pop songs were shitty, basically. I really hated the Giorgio Moroder version of Metropolis, and if you wanted to do a compare and contrast with the full version, I think you'll find that there's a facile emptiness to the Moroder version, which does a disservice to one of the classics of cinema, and particularly science fiction cinema. But Gottfried Huppert's music is fantastic. It combines classical music with some kind of 20th century modern beats to it. It really is one of the great unsung, and it's unsung because there's no lyrics, but one of the great unsung scores of early cinema. And I think that getting an orchestra to redo it again for this version of the film is just something marvellous. And it gives us as close as we're going to get to the original experience. We then go to the top of Metropolis and see how the other half live. We see Joe Fredderson, played by Alfred Abel, who runs the city, basically. He's got an assistant called Josephat, who basically is his 2IC, and he is controlling everything. The interesting thing is we see a little bit of technology here, including things not entirely dissimilar to flat screen TVs. They're in a totally different aspect ratio. But we see scrolling numbers on shares and stocks and resources scrolling down a wall of these screens, and that's kind of foreshadowing in a beautiful way. Now, of course, Joe Fredderson has a son, and his son Fredo is played by Gustav Fröhlich, who was a journalist. He wasn't actually an actor, he was a journalist at the time. And we see him in the Club of Suns, a beautifully well-lit kind of resort at the top of Metropolis for the sons of the very wealthy. They're doing athletic contests, they're kind of foreshadowing Leni Riefenstahl in some ways, and having a good time. And then we also see them in what's called the Eternal Garden, where the sons of the wealthy go to frolic with scantily clad women who are obviously sex workers, and who are only there for the pleasure of the sons of the wealthy. And of course that harks back to that sexualized hyperinflation in Germany that I mentioned earlier. A lot of the people who made this film were probably a part of that. Not Fritz Lang, but a number of other people. And so we see that, and the guys are frolicking with these women wearing see-through tops, and suddenly the doors of the Eternal Garden burst open, and a young woman called Maria, played by Bridget Helm, comes in with a whole bunch of scruffy little urchins and says to them, "These are your brothers." But of course the security guards take them away fairly quickly. But Freda has seen Maria, and he's smitten with her, whether it's her beauty and her angelic innocence, whether it's just a woman he hasn't seen before. But in some way it appears that Maria has kicked Freda's moral compass into alignment, and he goes on a journey where he travels to the underground, where the workers are working on the great heart machine and all of the other machinery that makes Metropolis function. And he swaps places with one of the workers and does a 10-hour shift of moving the arms of this giant clock machine that the guy was operating, and is totally exhausted at the end of the day, which gave him a little bit of a knowledge about how most of the people in the city of Metropolis actually live. Meanwhile, the guy he replaces goes off and hangs out at a nightclub and forgets to do what Freda asks him to do. We've also got the shadowy figure sent by the father to look after the son, a man called the Thin Man, who is creepy as hell and is kind of like the enforcer for Joe Fredersen. Then we also get, of course, the villain of the piece, the true villain, even though by my moral compass the villain of the piece is the father. But we also get to meet the mad scientist Rodfang, played by Rudolf Klein-Urroga, who is an inventor. He lives in an old house in the city of Metropolis, and he was once in a love triangle with Joe Fredersen for the affections of Fredersen's dead wife Hel. In fact, so smitten was Rodfang that he's built a monument in his house to this other guy's wife, which kind of freaks out Joe Fredersen when he goes and sees Rodfang. But Rodfang shows him his latest invention, which is a humanoid robot. And of course, that's the iconic image that we see of this film, of the robot before it transforms. And it's an Art Deco masterpiece. It's a beautiful piece of sculpture. It's a beautiful piece of character design. It's cold, it's mechanical, but it's undeniably feminine as well. It's a kind of Art Deco female figure in robot form. So Fredersen and Rodfang travel through a convenient tunnel that he has in the bottom of his house to a crypt way down below the city of Metropolis, where Maria is basically preaching at the workers on that they need to find a way to improve their life. They need to persevere. They need to become liberated from the drudgery that they're feeling. I mean, there's a lot of Christian iconography in this little crypt. Amongst other things, there are also skeletons there. Fredersen doesn't like this, of course, and so he and Rodfang between them think up a plan to discredit Maria. Now, there's a lot of modern kind of subtext to this movie about the 1% undermining anybody who goes up against them. So Maria could be seen as a substitute for any number of female political figures of the modern era. So Rodfang kidnaps Maria and uses her to change the robot into a robot Maria. He then sends the robot back down into the catacombs and foments revolution among the workers because the plan is, if you get the workers to revolt, then the rich people can slap them down even harder and stop them from ever fulfilling their potential. And so the robot Maria does that, and then the robot Maria also goes to the nightclubs of the rich and does erotic dances that drive men to dueling and suicide and murder and having fights and all sorts of things. So basically, the robot Maria is an agent of chaos both above the ground and below the ground. Of course, the revolution inevitably happens, though there is one person who's the voice of sanity in the workers, a supervisor called Grot, who knows that if the workers do stop working, then the heart machine and the pumps that keep their homes from being flooded by the waters around Metropolis are going to fail and their families will die. And so he tries to stop the revolution. It doesn't happen. And the real Maria, with the aid of Freda, who has had his epiphany, try to rescue all of the children of Metropolis while this revolution is going on and while the robot Maria becomes increasingly demented. And you get a big climax outside a cathedral. And Freda confronts Rodfang. People live more or less happily ever after, where the workers, through the mediation of Freda, come to an agreement with the bosses as typified by Joe Fredersen. I've got problems with that ending. I really do. I've got problems with it. Because I don't think things are that simple. And there's no consequence for Joe Fredersen for all of the shitty things he did to repress all these people underground, make basically bordellos for the sons of the wealthy, for all of the for being nasty to Josephat, who ends up being an ally of Freda in his mission to liberate the workers. There's no consequences for him. And that's possibly because Thea von Harbu was from an aristocratic family, so she wasn't going to smack down the wealthy and the privileged and the aristocratic. And it's no surprise to anybody that in 1933, when Fritz Lang left Germany to travel to America, Thea von Harbu stayed and ended up being very much a supporter of the Nazis. Now, the reason why Fritz Lang left was kind of interesting too, because he actually had to talk to Goebbels and said to Goebbels, I can't be one of your Aryans, I'm half Jewish. And Goebbels said to him, we decide who the Jews are. And so Fritz Lang, being a very canny man, said, let me think about it. And that night he pissed off to France and then to America. So that's the story of how Fritz Lang ended up making some really great film noirs and other films in America. So let's think about the movie for a little bit. It's about revolution, it's about passion, it's about the wealthy manipulating the poor. It's about somebody realizing that people are oppressed and doing something about it, though what Freda does mostly is run around trying to rescue Maria. And the courage that Maria has. In fact, the hero of the piece isn't Freda, it's Maria, by the fact that she does rescue all the children with Freda's help, but she's the person who's the engine of that. And it's about that kind of dynamic between privilege and workers in so many ways, even though the resolution of that's a little bit simplistic and a little bit uneven. But the creation of the film is fantastic. The sets are enormous in some cases. They had thousands of extras for this movie because it was cheap to get people to be extras in movies in Berlin in 1927. And Ufa knew that. A lot of the film was filmed on sets that weren't heated, so even when the water was pouring in and there were the flood scenes, everybody was freezing their asses off during that. Fritz Lang was a little bit brutal with his cast. There's some stunt work that's done in the climax, which Bridget Helm had to do herself, when she wasn't in the costume of the robot, which was incredibly uncomfortable to wear. There are times when she got overheated by it, it chafed, it was uncomfortable in a number of ways. So the making of this film over the many months it took to make was a kind of ordeal for many of the people making it. Ufa almost went bankrupt financing it as well. And there was no guarantee that the film was going to be a success. Even though Fritz Lang had a good track record with successful and thrilling movies. And this movie does have a lot of thrills to it too. Fritz Lang did that marvellous thing he did before almost anybody, of cross-cutting between different kinds of action. So you've got one frontier of action with the people being flooded. You've got Freda looking for Maria. He did that better than anybody in the 1920s. And that really works to build the tension in the film in a superb way. The special effects and the creation by Eugene Schuftan of the Schuftan process, which enabled people to appear to be in miniature sets, was a breakthrough for film technology. And the boldness of Fritz Lang's vision for this film was groundbreaking for the science fiction genre. Before that, he'd done fantasy movies like Die Nibelung, he'd done spy movies, he'd done crime movies with the Dr. Mabuse film. But this is the first time he tackled science fiction. Now, even though thematically there's not a lot here that's innately science fictional apart from the city itself, but it is one of the movies that started the genre and inspired many, many people to A, write science fiction and B, make science fiction movies. It was just so inspirational. And even movies as far into the future as Blade Runner in 1982 were influenced by the look and the style of Metropolis. It has had a profound influence on the science fiction genre for the last 95 years. And any movie that's got that kind of a track record and that kind of an inspirational long tail is a movie that we should respect and watch every now and then. I think it holds up well, and I think even though the characters are very much of their time, I think that Fritz Lang, leaving aside Thea von Harbu, who, as I said, became a Nazi, I think Fritz Lang really liked it. I mean, you've got to remember this is a time when people like Bertolt Brecht were making their plays. and Kurt Weill was making his music. So it was an incredibly culturally rich time in Germany in the 1920s. And Fritz Lang was very much a part of that, even though his wife turned into a Nazi. But then the guy who won the first Academy Award for Best Actor became a Nazi. And I've done a video about that, which I'll link in the description. But just to summarise Metropolis, revisiting it and seeing the completed version, I'd had this for a couple of years, but I hadn't watched the completed version. It really is a breakthrough film in science fiction. I love what Fritz Lang did with it. I love the boldness of what he did. The crowd scenes are incredibly well orchestrated. The iconic imagery, not just the robot Maria, but the iconic imagery of the workers trudging in and out of the shifts and working these enormous machines, is one that has resonated through the decades politically as much as it has in a cinematic context. It's an important piece of cinema, let alone an important science fiction film. And for that, I give it enormous respect. So thank you very much for watching. As always, please consider liking and subscribing and leaving a comment on this video. Let me know what you thought of it. If you have a different political viewpoint than me, let me know how you see Metropolis and the message that it's sending, because I think there's a lot to be discovered there. You can also support the channel, by the way, by going to patreon.com/paleocinema and donating. Next video I'm doing, I'm actually looking at the Marvel movie Eternals, which I just saw, and I've got some thoughts about that, and I'm not going to fanboy on this one. There are some problems with that film, but I'm going to discuss those in the next video, and the next science fiction video is going to be in a week from now. Anyway, look after yourselves, stay safe, watch some old science fiction movies, watch some new ones as well, because there is good stuff out there if you hunt it down, and I'll catch you next time.